It really is a great honor to be here. Over now almost 40 years, I've enjoyed coming back to San Diego and really just basking in the glow of the 1915-1935 Exposition. All of you are so fortunate to have this committee of 100 so hard at work holding on to this amazing legacy. It's really just an extraordinary place, an extraordinary site. I guess as I was thinking about some analogies for you, one that pops to mind is another site that all of you know so well. And I would simply offer this as something to think about. This park, these buildings are as important for San Diego as is the Eiffel Tower for Paris. And before long, you'll see the connection I'll try to make between the two of these. My assignment today is not so much to talk about the 1915 fair. I think all of you know a tremendous amount about this fair. And if you need to have your memories refreshed, if you need to know more about it, here is this absolutely wonderful book that Mike edited. This is Richard Amaro's book about the history of the 1915 fair. If you don't have a copy of this, you really should acquire it. It's an absolute treasure. And for historians of World's Fairs everywhere, I'm just so indebted to Richard, especially Mike, who's here, for bringing this book out. It's absolutely invaluable. So, 1915, here we are. You're surrounded on a daily basis by this particular site, by this particular fair. And what I want to do is try to locate this fair for you in the broader history of the history of World's Fairs and international expositions. There were a lot of World's Fairs. This was one of about 250 that were organized between 1851 and the Second World War. And there have been dozens since. So just to give you a little bit of a range, they start out in 1851, they continue across the late 19th, early 20th century, they continue past the Second World War. Great. Ranging across Europe, the United States, Asia. I call your attention to the very end of this chronology. Remember, I'm a historian, so I have to do chronology. But the question often comes up, so why don't we have World's Fairs anymore? And it's the wrong question, because there are World's Fairs. The right question is, why don't Americans know about them? And that's because the last World's Fair in the United States was 1984. And if we don't hold them, evidently they don't matter to us. And I think that's wrong, historically inaccurate. As you can see, the World's Fairs, there was an extraordinary fair. Most Americans totally unaware of it. A place called Shanghai, 2010. It attracted around 70 million visitors, an extraordinary number. The next fair, 2012, in Korea. There's a fair that opened just 2.5, 3 weeks ago in Milan. It's ongoing this summer. If you're off to Milan, take in the World's Fair. The next one after that, mapped out for Kazakhstan. And then the first World's Fair in the Middle East, planned for Dubai in 2020. So clearly, World's Fairs are not just the stuff of history. They're the stuff of a living present, the stuff of the future. World's Fairs, now as then, not always universally loved. So this is May Day in Milan, just a couple of weeks ago. What do Europeans do on May Day? They protest. What do they protest about? Any number of things. On May 1st, 2015, in Milan, anti-globalization demonstrators seized on this World's Fair to make their point. There's absolutely nothing new about that. The history of World's Fairs is filled with stories of confrontation and alternative worldviews. The fair in Shanghai, 2010, again, 70 million people attend this fair. It was absolutely extraordinary for the Chinese, extraordinary for Asia. I think absolutely incredible, of incredible importance for where this planet is going over the course of the next 100 years. Why? The theme of the fair, better cities. What are cities of the future going to look like? The Chinese actually took that on in great fashion. Not everyone would agree with the future they imagine, But just because you don't agree doesn't mean that future isn't being imagined. Pay attention to World's Fairs, those that are ongoing, those that are upcoming, because the fairs of today, like the fairs of the past, are going to have a terrific impact on the way all of us think about each other as this planet moves forward. So let me step back in time and try to position this fair in San Diego in the broader context of the history of World's Fairs. The first World's Fair, London, 1851. It's called the Great Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. It was a speculative adventure. The building itself, the Crystal Palace, designed in the form of a greenhouse by a landscape architect. His name was Joseph Paxton. The British government, its private financial backers, had no idea if it would succeed, although the odds were in their favor, because the patron of the fair was a guy by the name of Prince Albert, consort of Queen Victoria. So they were able to cut through a lot of red tape without too much difficulty. Okay? The fair far exceeded expectations. It attracted about 5 million visitors. It made a great deal of money, and it helped establish a sense of the importance of the British Empire for all the world to see. The interior view of the Crystal Palace, you can get a sense of this great atrium effect, this amazingly impressive building built from iron and glass. And bear that in mind in a couple of minutes, because it's really a leap of faith on the part of its promoters for all kinds of reasons. This fair was so successful, everyone took notice of it, especially Britain's European rivals. The fairs in Europe spread across the continent: Brussels, Vienna, Paris. This is the Paris Universal Exposition, 1878. Like the Crystal Palace Fair, it was intended to promote industry. It was intended to promote a sense of nation. What's missing from Paris in 1878? Yeah, absolutely. It's the Eiffel Tower. What do you get in Paris? You get the Eiffel Tower. It's built for a World's Fair. Paris, 1889, the anniversary of the French Revolution. This image coming from the next fair in Paris, the Universal Exposition of 1900. The attendance is worth noting. 6 months this exposition is open. It attracts an attendance of 50 million people. 50 million people. Okay? It's an extraordinary moment in the history of modernity. So why World's Fairs? Quick answers. Celebrations of local and national achievements. Celebrations of invention. These fairs are absolute engines of innovation. Infrastructure, parks like Balboa Park, the Champ de Mars in Paris, city parks across the United States, transportation systems, so on and so forth. Why are fairs held? Well, nobody wants to lose money off World's Fair, but virtually every World's Fair ever held has lost money. This one was an exception. Okay? This was an exception. World's Fairs generally lose money off gate receipts, but the investors don't lose money because people who invest in fairs generally invest in utilities, they invest in infrastructures, they invest in hotels, so they aren't out of cash, out of their own pockets generally. So one can be fairly cynical, maybe realistic, and simply think about World's Fairs in terms of monetary exchange. The fairs are far more important than that. And that gets us back to London in the 1840s. Maybe. Here we are, this is Hyde Park. This is a rally of Chartists, reformers, angry at the British government, crying out for political reform. Deeply unsettling to the British government, but not nearly as unsettling as what comes out of the British Library. This particular pamphlet, written about the same time by the man seated here, his name is Karl Marx. 1848, the pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, a massive challenge posed to industrialization and capitalism, calling for revolution across the industrialized world, primarily in Europe. And as we look at European history, follow the course of what's happening in 1848 through the 1870s, Europe is in turmoil. Revolution, Paris Commune. It's a time of great social, political unrest, extraordinary time of political violence. In the United States, of course, things were much more peaceful. 150 years ago, we forget, not so long ago, 150 years ago, Civil War came to an end. Historians now put the body count at over 700,000. Okay? So, Civil War. Followed, we forget this, 1873 by a financial panic. In some ways, that's more proximate to us because of what happened in 2008. Okay? We can more readily identify with the effects of a massive economic downturn. But imagine trying to pull a country back together after a civil war, only to find your efforts stymied, thwarted by this economic collapse. What to do about it? The U.S. government, together with civic leaders in Philadelphia, decided they would emulate Europeans and organize, guess what? A World's Fair. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876 to celebrate the anniversary of America's national independence, to give Americans, after the Civil War, a renewed sense of a national identity. The fair was an international exposition. It invited the nations of the world. It invited people from around the globe to witness, to bear witness to America's achievements. The woman draped in the American flag has a name. Anyone recognize her? She had a name. If you look really carefully, think about movies you've seen. Any of you seen any Screen Gems productions? You see her bearing a torch. It's Columbia, the national song of the United States. I won't sing it for you in its entirety. It goes something like this: Columbia, the gem of the ocean. Okay? It's not the Star-Spangled Banner. That comes later, thanks to Buffalo Bill, but that's a different story, different lecture. So here's Columbia, America's national symbol, inviting the world to see a nation put back together. What did people see? Among other things, works of art, works of national celebration, one of my favorite pieces of porcelain on this planet. Here is a George Washington vase with George Washington bounded by two bison heads. This is what makes World's Fairs so much fun. On the other side, the Corliss engine at Powered Machinery Hall, the world's largest steam engine. The slide here doesn't do it justice because it's actually painted bright colors, as were most American machines. At that time, this one is painted, guess what? Shades of red, white, and blue. This fair was financially successful, barely because of a bailout from the federal government. It inspired civic leaders in New Orleans to hold a World's Fair to help reconstruct the South. This is the World's Cotton Exposition, and now you know her name. There she is. There's Columbia. Notice the kind of creepy guy encroaching on her space. That's Uncle Sam, and he's about to get center stage. He's moving in. Columbia's going to disappear. In fact, she's going to be so far gone, most people don't remember that she really was the national icon. Okay? So, 1884, in the South, another effort through World's Fairs to help advance the cultural reconstruction of the United States, so badly dismembered and disunited by the Civil War. That inspires Congress to get into the act. And for the 1892 quadricentennial 400th anniversary of the landfall of Columbus in the New World, Congress put out a call to different cities inviting them to compete for a bid to hold a World's Fair to celebrate that event back in 1492. Boston, New York, St. Louis, Chicago all submitted bids. Long story, short story is Chicago won. And if you've read Devil in the White City, you know a little bit about the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. They're off a year. Should be 1892. Okay? It opens in 1893. Well, because it's Chicago, they missed it by a few months. Okay? They miss it actually because of labor unrest, because of bad weather, but they were able to dedicate the fair in 1892, and more about that in just a second. But just a quick visual image of the monumentality of this fair. The flag is very useful here because it reminds us that this entity called the United States is still anything but united in the 1890s. In fact, it's so disunited that the publisher of a children's magazine, along with World's Fair authorities, decides to seize on the occasion of the dedication of the fair in 1892 to compose something all of you recognize, and most of you certainly have engaged in. Today we call it the Pledge of Allegiance. Then it was called the Salute to the Flag. It was written and performed to dedicate the World's Fair in Chicago of 1893. The dedication is 1892. 1892 is the first Columbus Day. Why would anybody like me spend 40 years of his life studying World's Fairs? Because they're absolutely central for understanding the history of national identity. Okay? You can take a look at the words to the flag. It's a different salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation. There is no God in this salute. Added in the 1950s. One nation, indivisible. Think of that word in the context of people who remember the Civil War. Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The words to my flag, what do you do with your hand? You don't slap it over your heart. You raise it like this. And this remains the salute to the flag until, you can probably guess when. Late 1930s, 1940s, this, which increasingly becomes this, is going to be snapped back to this. Okay? It's funny what you learn from studying World's Fairs. So the attendance at these fairs is quite remarkable. 50 million in Paris. Chicago, this is a stereograph. The caption reads, "Surging Sea of Humanity." These fairs are massively popular. This is one day Chicago, 1893, late summer, maybe October. It's the only reason I like to be able to walk so I can read my captions. This is Chicago Day. Attendance one day at the Chicago Fair, 800,000 people. This is a world pre-electronic media. You can imagine how powerful this fair is, what kind of an impact it has. What did people see at the fair? They saw this extraordinary, expansive park, literally built for the fair, 7 miles south of the Loop. The White City, so called because of its monumental white buildings lined up along the shores of Lake Michigan. There's a strip heading up towards the top of this image, the aerial balloon, the captive balloon as it was called, hovering overhead. That mile-long avenue, the Midway Plaisance. It has actually three points of interest for you. The first, the Ferris wheel, designed by, it's Mr. Ferris. Okay, it's a trick question, like the Eiffel Tower. Who designed the Eiffel Tower? Nobody will ever say Eiffel, have to be prompted. This is Ferris's wheel. Look at this thing. Those are trolley cars. They each have seating capacity of 60 people. If you wanted to hold a wedding in 1893, the idea was you would stop the car, stop the wheel at the top. Minister would administer vows. People would raise their champagne glasses. They would come back to the base. 280 feet above the White City, commanding views of the city, of the fairgrounds. That's the center of the Midway. At either end of the Midway are two other things to pay attention to. Closer to the White City, the Woman's Building, not women's, but woman's building, an idealized view of women put right at the juncture of the White City with the Midway Plaisance. Other slide, please. Far into the Midway, the African village, the Dahomean village. The Midway was an outdoor anthropological museum representing different so-called races of the world. At the farthest extreme from civilization, the Africans. One could follow this social Darwinian representation of races right to the White City. Not accidental. the mediating force? Who's going to mediate between the forces of civilization and the forces of savagery? Women. The Women's Building, strategically located as well. World's fairs are not designed by accident. Next slide, please. Another view of the African village, that's Xavier Penet. He was a French railroad builder, a total cad in all sorts of ways. Here he is with about a handful of the 90 or so Dahomeans that he brought with him to the fair. This exhibit is going to recur at many subsequent World's Fairs. Next slide, please. The racial representations excited protest. The man on the left, you might recognize him. He's still alive. His name is Frederick Douglass. Most people think of Frederick Douglass in conjunction with the Civil War. He is still alive in 1893. He is actually the minister from Haiti, and he is the representative of the Haitian government at the fair, much to the chagrin of the promoters of the White City. Douglass finds a backdoor way into the exposition, and he uses his presence at the fair to decry the non-representation of African Americans. He has the assistance of a young newspaper editor. Her name is Ida Wells, soon to be Ida B. Wells. She's going to go to some fame herself as we move into the 20th century. Both of them organize a massive protest that forces the exposition to allow room for African Americans to hold a special day honoring their achievements since emancipation from slavery. Next slide, please. The attention to race becomes uppermost in the minds of the promoters of a World's Fair. The next World's Fair in Atlanta in 1895. This is another exposition devoted to the promotion of cotton in the South. This fair, for its opening day, actually boasts the presence of an African-American up-and-coming leader. His name is Booker T. Washington. And it is at this fair, those of you who know your American history, he gives one of the most famous addresses in American history called the Atlanta Compromise Address. What does he say? He holds up his hand and says, "We blacks and whites can be as separate as fingers on a hand and yet work together." So this is Washington's famous, infamous endorsement of what's going to come to be known as separate but equal. Next slide, please. The World's Fair movement enters Nashville. Tennessee Centennial, a permanent exposition building if you've ever been to Nashville or are going to Nashville. The Parthenon, how interesting. There's the Parthenon replica, built of concrete, still standing in Nashville, Tennessee. Next slide, please. In some ways, my favorite fair, because my grandmother went and left this little souvenir spoon that I grew up with. I had no idea it was going to become this kind of talisman or curse. I think it's because of the spoon she left me that I somehow was fated to study World's Fairs. But in any event, this fair, it has one of my favorite names of any World's Fair. This is 1898. It is Omaha, Nebraska. It's a little white city modeled after the Chicago Fair. The name of the fair, the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition. I mean, how cool is that? I mean, if you're going to do a World's Fair, you don't think small. Next slide, please. The next fair, one that perfectly encapsulates the Gilded Age, its struggles, its, I guess, in so many ways, the underlying current of violence. 1901, another fair, Buffalo, New York. The theme of this fair, the Pan-American Exposition. Think about it. Buffalo, New York, and it's a fair dedicated to promoting trade with, of all places, Mexico and South America. Buffalo, New York. The idea is canals, seaways, and opening markets to the South. It's actually a brilliant idea. But the fair ends in tragedy. President of the United States, his name is William McKinley, goes to the fair, the Temple of Music, that's the building on the right, and greets the crowds one very hot afternoon. And an anarchist, reputed anarchist by the name of Chauglitz, has a small pistol concealed under a handkerchief, and at point blank range fires 2 shots. McKinley is going to die, a turning point in American history. His vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, is going to become president of the United States. Next slide, please. The biggest World's Fair in American history in terms of acreage covered. It's the one you probably know about because of the music. It's St. Louis. It's 1904. The music, meet me in St. Louis, Louis. Meet me at the fair. Another white city, monumental buildings, extraordinary buildings. Forest Park, about 4 miles outside of downtown St. Louis. All of these buildings built as temporary structures, save one. There were a couple of permanent structures that I believe that are still standing as part of Washington University. The theme of the fair, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The real purpose of the fair, to celebrate America's contemporary expansion into the Pacific and control over the Philippine Islands. Next slide, please. For this fair, the U.S. government, the War Department, as it was then called, actually organized a display of 1,200 Filipinos and put them on exhibit at the fair on something called the Philippines Reservation. Next slide, please. You can see a group of Filipinos here in this stereo card. You can't see this image as clearly as I would like, but the women seated on a bench, one of them actually has opera glasses. Next slide, please. One of the Negritos on exhibit at the fair. The caption is hard to read, but scrawled in kind of a backslash fashion is the name given to this man, Missing Link Number 1. Next slide, please. A document signed by somebody who's going to play a commanding role in this fair. He's a physical anthropologist from the Smithsonian. His name is Alex Hrdlicka, and he's going to be responsible for many of the exhibits that are going to go on view at the fair and remain after the fair in the Museum of Man. Hrdlicka, like other anthropologists, use World's Fairs as data collection sites. So everyone knew that something happened at World's Fairs with disease. People die, especially people from different cultures, come to World's Fairs, are brought to World's Fairs. They acquire diseases, they bring diseases with them, and they die. The War Department isn't stupid. They set aside 40 grave sites in St. Louis for anticipated deaths of people from other countries, from other places on the globe, who are exhibited at or perform at World's Fairs. Thankfully, not that many died. 3 of the Filipinos died. Those 3 who died at the fair actually had the mark of distinction of losing their heads. How so? Physical anthropologist Alex Hrdlicka decided to utilize their deaths to remove their heads from their necks, to open up their skulls, remove their brains, and ship them to the Smithsonian Institution. So World's Fairs have a history. They have a history that many people are made uncomfortable by, and that's a good thing. But it's part of the history. It's part of what gave these fairs a certain measure of authority to actually have people like Hrdlicka involved in saying we can document what progress looks like, and we can continue to gather data to underwrite how we define and think about progress. Next slide, please. The World's Fair movement heads out to the West Coast. Louisiana Purchase in 1904 basically reinvents Lewis and Clark. As you know the story, perhaps, Lewis and Clark basically disappeared from history. Jefferson was so disappointed in them and their failure to find the Northwest Passage. He really was angry at them and preferred not to even have their names mentioned in his company. Lewis and Clark disappear from history textbooks until the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Promoters of a fair in Portland, 1905, seize on Lewis and Clark. There's Columbia, she's back. This fair is called the Lewis and Clark and Oriental International Exposition, and it's going to be followed by another fair in the Northwest. Next slide, please. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. That's the moniker above the colonnades in Portland. That's the slide above. Below, a fair in Seattle, not the 1962 fair, but the first Seattle fair, the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909. And it occupied, if you've been on the University of Washington campus, several of the buildings. I think there's maybe one, perhaps 2 of those are still standing on that campus today. That was the site of the fair. Mount Rainier in the background. Next slide, please. There we go. Westward, the course of empire at this Portland fair. Next slide, please. In Seattle, these shows, here again, the Igorots, the effort to promote the acquisition of the Philippine Islands continues. One of the tropes, I guess, that underlies all of these fairs, the racial representations of people from around the world. Next slide, please. The next fair, Jamestown, 1907, intended to celebrate the discovery of Jamestown. Teddy Roosevelt appears at this fair. American presidents routinely came to World's Fairs. Next slide, please. Then we get to California, the fair you probably don't want to hear about. San Francisco, the PPIE. In case you're wondering how the Panama Canal was constructed, he did it. That's Hercules. That's Hercules. Parting the isthmus, and the cute little boats make their way not to San Diego in this rendition, but up to San Francisco. Next slide, please. 1916. Okay? Between 1876 and 1916, about 100 million Americans attend World's Fairs. Next slide, please. That brings us to San Diego. And in some ways, this should be the end of my story. But every end contains within it beginnings. So let's talk about the beginnings that this fair helped create. Next slide, please. Things don't go well for the world. In 1915, 1916, there's an event that, quite curiously, is not getting nearly enough attention in this country today. First World War. Great War for Civilization, as it was called at the time. It's an extraordinary conflict, and it leaves Europe devastated. Next slide, please. In the United States, after the war, prosperity returns. One of my favorite images. Feel-good image. This is 1929. Prosperity paramount, astrologers forecast. But then fire, food, vice, disease, epidemics, and disaster also are to be expected for the new year. Okay? So we've got a world struggling to recover from the First World War. We have in this country a moment when the economy is standing at the brink. Next slide, please. And you know what comes next. Okay, within living memory, still, of a generation that fought in the Civil War, the nation that they helped rebuild stands on a point of disintegration again, a massive economic disaster. Question, what do you do with the world again on the brink of coming apart? Look to Europe, the rise of the Nazis. Look to the Soviet Union, the rise of the Soviet Union. Look to Imperial Japan. Look at the economy in the tank and worse. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to stave off disaster? One answer, not the only answer, but one answer, next slide please, is to reinvent the medium of the World's Fair. Chicago, San Diego, Dallas, Cleveland, New York, San Francisco. A decade of World's Fairs, feverish World's Fair building, launched by the Chicago, 1933, worst year of the Depression. They launch a fair, they build a fair and extend it for 2 years, called of all things, the Century of Progress Exposition. Next slide, please. That brings us back to San Diego. Franklin Roosevelt appears right here, Balboa Park. He's in the company of the Japanese consul, and he's being greeted by Exposition President Frank Dugan. Next slide, please. 1939 takes us back to San Francisco, Treasure Island, the fair that most people just don't remember, even in San Francisco. Treasure Island, which is the human-made island adjacent to Yerba Buena, is built as the initial site for the San Francisco airport. It becomes the site for the Golden Gate International Exposition with this really extraordinary architecture, this Mayan come Cambodian architecture. It's absolutely phenomenal. Next slide, please. But let's not just look at the architecture, let's look at the fair that's dedicated, that fair in 1939. It's actually dedicated in 1936, sorry. If you pay attention to the flags at the dedication ceremony, this is a world already in being. It's a world becoming. It's a world headed in a particular direction. You see the swastika. You see the flag of Imperial Japan. You can actually read through this fair a world that is suffering from tremors that are about to erupt into full-fledged major earthquake zones. Next slide, please. That's particularly clear in Paris, 1937. The building on the left is the pavilion of Nazi Germany, designed by Albert Speer. He stole the plans from the Soviet Union so he could build the Nazi pavilion just a few meters higher. The building directly across the esplanade, you see the heroic worker. That's the Soviet pavilion. Between the two, the pavilion of Spain that puts on public display for the first time Picasso's Guernica. Okay, World's Fairs and the Arts, subject well worth thinking about. Next slide, please. 1939, an extraordinarily optimistic moment. New York holds a World's Fair. Its theme, the world of tomorrow. And that is probably a good point to come to a close. Next slide, please. 1851, 1940. World's Fairs worldwide attracted about 1 billion people. 1 billion people. And they're often viewed as reflections of a world that's coming into being. I would beg to differ with that view. They don't just reflect. They shape. They form. They're formative. The world we live in today, something you know so well, is formed and shaped very much by the place we occupy today. This park, the legacy of a fair back in 1915 and 1935. Thank you all very much.